Diplomacy world hits the stands. Tournaments coming in many lands. And Aussie club play expands. I'm David Hood of the Diplomacy Broadcast Network, and this is Deadline, DBN's monthly news program. Dateline, July 2024. For our feature story, some of us in the diplomacy hobby are no spring chickens. We are quite well experienced, been around the block a few times. All right, fine. We're just plain old. But there are others in our hobby who are quite the opposite. In a recent virtual and extended Deadline event catered to those less aged among us, it's called the inaugural Youth Diplomacy Championship, or the YDC. It brought together 3 boards of players, all 20 years old or below, and we'll hear about it later in this program as we interview each of the 3 board toppers during our panel discussion. But first, a look at headlines from around the world of diplomacy. Issue 166 of our hobby's flagship magazine, Diplomacy World, was just released in early July by editor and publisher Doug Kent. This summer 2024 edition featured articles on the new face-to-face variant compendium, the retirement of Russ Dennis from the Briefing newsletter, and a bevy of tournament results and tournament promotion for the face-to-face scenes on both sides of the Atlantic. World DipCon was a popular topic of conversation throughout the zine, joined by an interview with DixieCon winner Karthik Kanath, as well as information on the Origins winner Andrew Boyd. Bill Hackenbracht also reported on the current status of the face-to-face registry that he started several years ago, which now includes contact information for, I kid you not, over 1,150 players worldwide who have expressed interest in hearing about opportunities to play the game in person through leagues, clubs, and tournaments. This issue of DW is just chock full of important and entertaining content, so check it out using the link provided below. There's club news this month, both from England and from Australia. On September 7th at 12:30 p.m., the London Diplomacy Club will host its next house game at The Magpie, which is a Victorian-era pub near Liverpool Street Station in London. Conrad Woodring, Marvin Freed, and others have revitalized face-to-face play in London, as well as resurrecting the UK National Championship to be held September 27th through 29th in Warrington. A link to the club's Facebook page is provided in the show notes below so you can keep abreast of the British diplomacy goings-on. And then the recent explosion of hobby activity down under has now touched Sydney in New South Wales, where a new club for face-to-face play has been formed with a presence on Facebook. This, in addition to the growing club in Canberra and the expansion of the face-to-face tournament list from just one, PoppyCon, to several events for 2024, including ones coming up in Brisbane, Melbourne, and Canberra. A link to the Sydney Club's Facebook group is provided below, as is an event page for their next game on August 16th, to be held in the community of Constitution Hill. Now, as far as upcoming face-to-face diplomacy events with potential DB&I points are on the line are concerned, we basically have an embarrassment of riches for the remainder of the summer and into the early fall. Here is a rundown. August 9 through 11 sees the running of the Boston Massacre at Pandemonium Books and Games in Cambridge, Massachusetts. 2 weeks after that, SkyCon takes place in Bozeman, Montana, August 23rd through 25th. That same weekend in Brisbane, in Queensland, a new event hits the Australian circuit called the Cane Toad Classic. Moving into September, the European Diplomacy Championship will be held in Sion, Switzerland, September 13 through 15. Next up, the first ever National Diplomacy Masters at the World Series of Board Gaming in Las Vegas, Nevada on September 23rd. Later that week sees the triumphant return of the UK National Championship in Warrington, Cheshire, as I mentioned, September 27 through 29. And then the following weekend, we have Weaselmoot 18 taking place in Chicago, Illinois, October 5th and 6th. And then the weekend after that comes the Asia Pacific Diplomacy Championship, October 12th and 13th in Melbourne, Victoria. Come on now. There is no excuse for you not to attend one of these events. Now, is there? Links are provided below for your registration convenience, including a link to the schedule page of the DBN website, which has many of these events listed. Let's turn now to the subject of virtual face-to-face leagues. That same schedule page on the DBN website includes information about upcoming game days in August and September for the Virtual Diplomacy League, the 7 Years War League, and the Tour of Britain. These involve live games played with audio channels on Discord and using the Backstabber platform. In addition, Season 1, Round 6 of the Snake Pit League, based in Australia, took place on July 28th, the next one coming up in August. Our League Night show here on DBN recorded its latest episode on July 13th, and that included 5 VDL games as well as all 3 of the Youth Diplomacy Championship games. If you missed that coverage, there is a link to that video provided in the show notes below, along with links to league information. Every month, we like to report on the latest and greatest audio, video, or visual content from creators we call our DBN media partners. The DiploStrats channel on YouTube just dropped another video analyzing the play of a particular variant, in this case, Hellenic Diplomacy, which is an 11-power variant currently being play tested on WebDip. Commentator Ezio was playing Scythia in that game, so both he and fellow commentator Captain Mean through the entire game in this roughly 3-hour video linked below did serious commentary. Captain Meme has also posted a couple of diplomacy-themed quizzes in the Sporkle website, so we have linked that below as well. And then moving to the Diplomacy Briefing, which is our hobby's weekly newsletter, it's now under the capable leadership of Lady Razor, after a retirement from the leadership team of the Briefing's founder, Russ Dennis. Recent editions of the newsletter include, in addition to the important hobby news, articles from Sarin Kwok about a recent London Diplomacy Club game, and a reprinted Konrad von Metzke article from 1992 about diplomacy as a study of the human condition. A link to the briefing's website can be found below in the show notes. Returning now to the world of virtual face-to-face diplomacy, the 2024 Summer Classic Virtual Tournament will have its preliminary rounds Friday, August the 2nd through Sunday, August the 4th, with a top board 2 weeks later on Sunday, August 18th. Time on that is TBD, depending on who qualifies. This tournament is designed to be as international friendly as possible, with 6 rounds at various times over the weekend. Players are allowed to play in as many rounds as they like, but only your best 3 scores will count to your final score. For those new to the concept of virtual face-to-face, as I mentioned earlier, it involves playing live on Backstabber while using Discord audio channels for negotiation. Michalis Kamarites is the primary organizer this year, but also could use some help. If you are interested, please contact him on the VWDC Discord server. A link to the Summer Classic announcement can be found below, and of course, we will have full coverage of this year's event right here on DBN. The biggest news in the online extended deadline community has to be the recent conclusion of the main event for Season 2 of the Olympus tournament using the Backstabber platform. Ed Sullivan and his Diplomatch channel on YouTube has been the place to follow top board action for extended deadline tournaments in general. The Season 2 main event finals have been covered on the Diplomatch now for many weeks, with the most recent video featuring commentary from Sullivan and from Keith Worstel on the game through the end of 1911 and then through the conclusion of 1912. Jordan Connors France has won the event by declared draw at 10 centers, versus a trio of players at 7 centers each. Jordan, who's known as Conk online, had this game well in hand for several years before the draw was declared. To catch all the action in this exciting game from the very beginning, subscribe to the Diplomatch channel linked below. Also, the Nexus Press League continues its 2024 season, with games beginning every few weeks. You can find information about that on the DBN schedule page that I mentioned earlier. In late-breaking news, as this episode is being recorded, I am pleased to report that DBN's own co-founder Zachary Moore of Minnesota just won the 2024 edition of the Regatta face-to-face tournament in Boulder, Colorado, edging out some relative dweeb who came in second. In third was Randy Lawrence Hurt, followed by fellow North Carolina resident Keith Worstel in fourth. Rounding out the top 7 of this event, run by Manus Hand and the Armada team, were Cameron Higby of Missouri, Kansas resident Alicia Carden, and DBN personality Ben Kelman of Michigan. DBN coverage of all 15 boards of this event is now available on YouTube. By the time you see this broadcast, that will have already taken place live, but you can still catch it on the DBN channel. Ed Sullivan's back channel interviews with several players on the scene will be featured in the August edition of this show, Deadline. Thought you would get through an entire episode of Deadline without news from the world of artificial intelligence? Nuh-uh. Two Spanish researchers in Barcelona have tried to one-up Meta's AI bot called Cicero with a bot of their own, called, of course, Attila. Whereas they describe Cicero as a black box, making it impossible to know exactly why Cicero can successfully negotiate with human players, Attila was designed to make that information easier to glean. The key, according to the authors, was using only symbolic AI in Attila's design and then using a different method for evaluation of the bot's performance that has been used in the past. I cannot possibly do the concept justice here, which is why you should just read the extended abstract of their article for yourself using the link I've provided below. And now, let's enjoy the latest installment of our continuing series of interviews with tournament winners, which we call the Winner's Circle. This month, we talked to 3 winners from the inaugural Youth Diplomacy Championship virtual face-to-face tournament. From Germany, we welcome Simon Wiesendrup and Paul Biel. And then from the Netherlands, we have Jelte Kuiper, who is also the reigning European Diplomacy Champion. All right, welcome to the Scream, everyone. Jelte, I am going to start with you. Tell us your diplomacy origin story, and then explain how you came up with the idea of the Youth Diplomacy Championships.
Well, actually, those are pretty intertwined. I'm pretty young still. And I started playing diplomacy when I saw it online, I think about 8 years ago. So I would have been 10 then, or maybe 11. And then I decided to join the European Open Championship in Amsterdam in 2019 because, I liked the game. I wanted to play it in person. And, well, a European Championship in Amsterdam seemed like a perfect opportunity for me. So I joined there. And I had a really fun experience playing the game. But I also noticed that especially for some players, the environment isn't ideal for younger players. I think at least it felt like the next youngest player would have been like 10 years older than I was. So I thought, well, we see that sometimes it can be harder for newer and younger players to get involved in the hobby. Or they might like a space with age peers to practice in. So that's one of the major reasons I came up with hosting a Youth Diplomacy Championship. Another one is there's, especially from some veteran players, sometimes some backlash towards younger players. And I kind of wanted to show that, hey, we're young, but we play diplomacy well, and, well, we deserve to be in the scene.
Well, I can't thank you enough for making that realization and then putting it into practice. I, at one time, was young myself, and I started playing this game when I was 18, actually. It was just a long time ago. But I remember going to my first tournament when I was 20, and it was a little bit off-putting to have people that were a lot older than you not necessarily treat you as an equal. So I understand where you're coming from there. Paul, let's go over to you. How did you get into diplomacy, and then why did you decide to play in this event?
I started with 17 years. I got a physical copy of the game from my father. He saw it online. He's a big fan of board games, and he thought this game was something I could play with my friends. So I did, and I started playing. We had some very, very fun matches, and I wanted to play more, but we didn't have much time, so I started playing online just because, especially extended deadline is something I can really enjoy. I can play every day, spare a few minutes. And yeah, I then started to join the Nexus Leagues. finished at a top 10 spot last year, played in the Olympus tournament, and also almost got into the final. So yeah, I'm quite happy with my performance so far. And then Jelte knew me personally, so he invited me to play. And I said, yeah, I can join for sure. And I played in the extended deadline version of his Youth Diplomacy Championship.
Mm-hmm. Yep. All right, Zimon, let's go over to you. Tell us your diplomacy backstory, and then tell us what was it like to play in this event that was limited to players close to you in age.
I'm not sure if it's much of a backstory. I saw a YouTube video from a person called Oliver Luck on, hey, this is a fun game that exists, and the mechanic seemed fun. It seemed like a tactical game, which I have now learned it isn't, sadly. But it seemed like a tactical game, so that entranced me. And then
partially tactical. It's partially tactical.
There's a tactical part, however. Yeah, but then that very same person proposed a diplomacy game, and I thought, hey, I have time, why not? I think it was in the late stages of the pandemic as well, so I did have a lot of time. Was still in school back then. Yeah, and then I started playing diplomacy. Started playing on like a web dip game once, and then joined Nexus leagues. Played a few games there, but extended deadline never really worked for me well. So I almost stopped playing at some point, and then I think I found DBN actually, and noticed that virtual diplomacy was a thing, and since then I've been playing that a lot.
How did it go to play in an event with people your age?
I wouldn't even say that was that difficult from any normal event. Like the biggest difference was that there weren't any people except for Jelte with big names. Like there weren't any world champion titles being thrown around. There weren't any diplomats of the year or whatever, or this person won VDL last year. So that made a difference. I didn't know the people as well, but apart from that, it was just a very normal game as far as it felt for me.
Well, let's talk about your game for just a minute, Zimon, staying with you. On your board, you ran what appeared to me to be a pretty strong alliance, but then you're the one that ended up on top. How did that happen?
I had a lot of luck. I had a Turkish ally that was convinced that building fleets would be hilarious when seen on DBN. So he built a lot of fleets. And if you're playing in NAT and just have 5 fleets in every Turkish home center and the Black Sea, then that doesn't really work well for stabbing Austria. So he was never in a position to stab me, and I was at some point in a position to stab him, and thought, okay, I either go against Germany here or I stab my ally. And stabbing my ally seemed like the better play to win, so I did not.
Was that Jaromir that was playing Turkey? I
yes.
forgot. Yeah. I've met. He's been to my tournament a couple of times. He's a great guy.
Very nice person. I agree.
Very nice. Yes. Jelte, your game seemed a little different than that. I know it was still an Austria game.
Yeah.
But tell me, I wasn't sure during that game that the most likely scenario was going to be you coming out on top. So tell me how that happened.
Yeah, no, so I started the game as Austria, and at the beginning of the game, it looked like there would be some sort of IT, which was committed to early on, as well as an AR, which was committed on like 401, so pretty soon as well. But then I managed to get both Italy and Turkey on site. So I suddenly find myself allied to all my neighbors. But they were not allied to each other. So it was I was juggling 3 alliances, and that was a tough situation. But I managed to disentangle them. Meanwhile, in the West, it was a lot less chaotic. There was a very strong alliance between England and France, which more or less kept going for the entire game. Whereas in the East, to respond to that, we all kind of needed to take out Turkey. So we did that. then around that time, I got stabbed first by Russia, which failed horrendously, and then by Italy, which also failed horrendously. So I managed to get the strongest position there. And at the end, it looked like a race between me and the player playing England. And Russia, possibly because we had been allied all game, possibly because he felt guilty about his stab on me, was happy to let me win over England.
That makes
that's
sense.
how I win.
Well, I think one lesson is if you try to stab Yelta, you will fail miserably. That's what I heard you say in so many words. All right, Paul, you also had an interesting scenario in your game going into the mid game. You were in the West. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I played England. I was quite happy about that because in my games, England is either win hard or lose hard. And I won hard this game. I had a really strong partner in France. He was, my major ally. And meanwhile, the East was very divided. So I decided to go for a really early stab of my French ally in the fall of 05. Went up to 12 centers. And I had to keep all those centers for 5 more years until 1910. And with a little bit of diplomacy, a little bit of mismanagement in the East, I managed to hold on, and all the players agreed to a draw in the end in 08, I think. And it was a really great success because at some point I thought they broke me, but I got the right time for the stab, and I felt a little sorry for my French ally because he was really committed, but in the end I managed to bring it home.
Yeah, you did. It was kind of a commanding lead, so much so that they did give up 2 years early because that game could have lasted to 1910, right? That's the way that was set up.
Yeah, exactly. It was originally with the end date of 1910. I offered a draw first in 06, I think, as I got up to 12 centers with, I think, four centers in the lead over France, who was really going down. And in the end, I think Turkey managed to get second place by stabbing Austria, but he wasn't strong enough to really overcome my defenses in Moscow and Warsaw. So I brought it home.
Yeah, you really did. Let's broaden or widen our focus a little bit from just your game, Paul, and talk about the event in general. How did the concept of the Youth Diplomacy Championship work out in practice, do you think? And do you think it should be held every year or more regularly?
Oh, I really like the concept. I think it really brings new people together. I had also, I think, one younger player who wasn't not really experienced and only joined diplomacy for playing this event or was really new to the scene. And I think it should be held annually just because it's a really refreshing event from all those really high skilled capped games. As Simon said, there is nobody who was world champion before or some other really strong player. The only thing I'm a little sad that it's really hard to defend your title because you're only allowed to play for like 2 to 3 years at best because I don't know anyone who's playing diplomacy in the age of 14, and that's an issue. I think I'm only allowed to play, I think, one more year when I'm 19, and after that, no more. So I think that's a little sad, but then I probably have to move on to some bigger events like an online championship or something like that.
Well, all good things come to an end. So you can't. It's funny that you mentioned age 14 because when I ran a DipCon years ago, there were 5 kids that all came at the same time to play. They were all age 14. And I had to convince one of them's dads to just let them stay with us over the weekend because he was like, I don't know, these guys are only 14. I said, it's fine. A lot of us are dads. It'll work out. It'll be fine. So sometimes they do start them really early. One of those guys is still playing in DixieCon every year. And this was 20 years ago.
Nice.
Yeah. Zeman, you've played in virtual games before. So how did this experience differ if it did?
I think mainly in what Paul just reiterated, in that there weren't any people who you can point at and say this is the big threat, to either ally them or take them out, even though the latter usually doesn't work in my experience. It was that there were a lot of people that I didn't know. That's unusual, I think. There were like, I only knew half of the people, and on those mostly by reputation or by having seen their names before once. So that's probably the biggest difference. Apart from that, it was a game of diplomacy. Like, there was one person for which I think this was the first virtual game, but they had played a lot of diplomacy before. They knew their tactics, certainly. So maybe like in Russia's game, I think one saw a bit of mismanaged time, but that was the only thing that really struck me as different from usual. Apart from that, it was just a normal game of diplomacy, only with players in the younger age bracket, which usually I'm at least not able to see on Discord profiles.
Well, I should point out that perhaps there was nobody to point at and say, look, here's the big threat until now. So when you guys play next year, they're going to be pointing at you, say, look, here you're the big threat. So that'll be something fun for you to deal with next year.
I'm not allowed to play next year, sadly.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, you're going to age out. Yeah.
We did all point at Yelta before the game started.
Well,
everyone at our table said, "Oh,
and it
we're
didn't
happy
work.
that Yelta's not playing."
Yeah, it didn't work. Yeah. So, Yelta, do you plan to make any changes in the structure or the format of the event if you decide to run it again in the future?
Yes. So I like, in general, the way the event is set up. But we had only one time slot for the virtual games, which meant that there sadly weren't any young players from Australia, Asia, and the Pacific region able to participate, which, is pretty sad. They all had to play in the extended deadline game, so I definitely want to change that for the future games. And of course, as a tournament director, I would very, very much like to not have to play myself next year. In terms of the overall structure, I think there are going to be no major changes to the event, but I have not fully decided there.
Okay, that's fair. Well, let's talk, Yelta, just a little more broadly about the game of diplomacy and younger players. Is there anything that we in the hobby could do to make our events more welcoming to the next generation of our diplomacy fans out there?
Yeah. I think one of the big things I've noticed as a young player, which some players and some events have done very well, and some players and events have done poorly, is how you look at younger players. There are events and players which have looked at younger players like myself as any diplomacy players. There are diplomacy players who, to say it a bit boldly, know they have the age to be your dad or your granddad and behave like it, which is not
sure what
that
happened
fun
there.
an experience. And there are also players which look at you like an opportunity for dots if you look really young, which I think in the hobby, we need to look like the Australian hobby has been doing at how we structure our events and how we structure the priority of the events, and to make it very clear that player safety and player involvement and the sense of community are much more important than tournament fans and game results. It's about inclusion.
Zimon, do you think that older hobbyists have something to learn from the younger players or vice versa?
In the technical term, that any diplomacy player has something to learn from any other diplomacy player, for sure. And especially younger players do have something to learn from older players, because the group of older players is just that much bigger. Like, there's an Andrew Groff in the group of older players, and I would argue that almost any, if not any, diplomacy player has to learn something from Andrew Groff, or can learn something that will improve their game. I think I in general don't think that it's very useful to differentiate between age in this specific setting, because I didn't really notice major differences in the play of people in this game in comparison to other virtual games I've played in. So for me, it was just as I said twice before, I think a very, very normal, very usual game. So I think the biggest factors that probably differentiate younger players from older players is that I would assume that a lot of younger players tend to play more online than face to face, just because there's a lot of scattered people, I feel like, that have come to this game online, which tend to be younger. Not always are younger, but tend to be younger. So that probably does influence how the group of younger players behaves in regards to the group of older players. But I wouldn't blame that on age, but more just on the different ways the people came to the game. I don't really think that there's anything fundamental about the age that could be taught or learned from either side.
Gotcha. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Paul, what do you think is the hardest thing for younger or maybe just beginning players to master as they work on improving their play of diplomacy?
So I can only speak for myself here, but for me it was really important to know what the other person wants. This sounds very broad, but I think this is the most basic skill you need to have if you want to be good at diplomacy. You want to know, hey, for example, my ally in France, he really wants a strong ally. He is looking for an opportunity to get as many dots as fast. And then he'll be happy and he'll stay with me. So maybe I have to concede Belgium to him if I play England, in that example. Or maybe he just wants to be safe from Germany. So I need to ensure that. And that's something I really like about the game of diplomacy, that you can always improve those skills. For example, I personally found it also very helpful if I know someone is lying, to really point that out and say, hey, why are you lying to me? I know you're not telling me the truth. Is there something we can work around here to maybe cut a deal? And or if you could stop lying, maybe we can find other ways to communicate. And I think, working on your basic communication with all of your allies and your enemies is really important, much more important than what kind of moves you're doing, or if you get 1 dot more this year, or if you get the dot 2 years later. And I think that's the first biggest step from being a player who just sees dot, takes dot, to being an actual very skilled player who can also take on stronger opponents than he himself.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, I think we're probably ready for final thoughts here. Zimon, I'm going to start with you. Do you have any final thoughts for our audience about the YDC or about diplomacy in general?
The Youth Diplomacy Championship was a lot of fun. That was an interesting game of diplomacy. Like any game of diplomacy, in the optimal case, is fun. If not, then something went wrong. And Yelda's a good organizer, so he made sure of that. I think the most interesting thing about this tournament in particular was for me that I saw some names that I'd only previously seen on Discord, and for the first time noticed, oh, those people aren't all above 30, because before that I kind of assumed that most people I saw were, just because I think it's probably the truth, especially in this circle, at least, of diplomacy players. So that was interesting. That was a lot of fun. If anyone's below the age of 20, it's a lot of fun. Go play it. At the very worst, you'll do poorly and see that everyone else your age is much better than you, and they need to train more. Like it's a very fun tournament.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. Paul, how about you? Your turn. Tell us your final thought.
Oh, I think it was a really refreshing and new and exciting game. I was really happy to get an extended deadline version of the YDC. I asked the Alti about this because in the first place, he only wanted to play virtual face-to-face, but I'm glad I got him convinced to do otherwise. And yeah, I think it gave me a good idea of how my skills have developed in contrast to other players, and really how many different people are there playing Diplomacy, and as Simon pointed out, how many of the names I see on Discord are actually from people who are in my range of age, and I think that was a great experience.
I'm so glad to hear that. Yelta, thank you for running this, and then also give us your final thoughts here.
Yeah, well, I loved running the event. I loved interacting with all the younger people. I would like to encourage anyone under the age of 20 to reach out, maybe for a casual game, maybe for next year's edition. I would love to have you. Also, for anyone who think maybe they want to get their children into the game and want to do so in a safe environment for that, I think we're a great opportunity. So please reach out.
All right, that's great. In fact, the word ausgezeichnet comes to mind for this interview. I really appreciate it. And see you all around the next Diplomacy event. And now it's time for a segment of our show we call How to Play. This is where an experienced hobbyist gives our audience tips on how to play Diplomacy through a one-on-one interview about a specific topic, which we call the deadline question. This month, we ask well-known player Greg Matthews of British Columbia, who's also known as Ewok or Village Idiot online, the deadline question. What does Alliance player really mean? Greg, welcome back to Deadline.
Thanks, David. It's great to be back.
Yeah. All right, before we start talking about the phrase Alliance player, let's let you give us your Diplomacy origin story, if you would.
Sure, be happy to. So I started playing Diplomacy back in 2011. I was my workplace. They were organizing some games. I wasn't familiar with the game at all, but they needed an extra person, so they pulled me in, and I just took to it right away. Had some good success, and then slowly they lost interest in it, and I wanted to keep playing. So I got involved in Play Diplomacy, started playing there. At the time, I was having my first child on the way, so it fit nicely into my lifestyle of having a lot of little pockets of spare time. So this new online game that I found just worked out well. It actually wasn't until years later that I even realized it was not originally an online game, that it came from board game roots, and this entire other community existed. But I stuck with it. I started to climb up the ranks and Play Diplomacy and Web Diplomacy and the other online sites, and since then I've been doing a lot of tournament play in online. And now that my kids are getting a little bit older, I'm slowly dipping my toes into some of the face-to-face and virtual. I don't quite have weekends free yet, but it's getting a little bit more possible to do it once in a while.
I understand. Yeah. Well, you are particularly known, I think, as an online extended deadline player, but you have tried the other formats.
I have
as well. So how does that compare? Compare and contrast the different formats, just briefly, if you would.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's that's a deep question.
True.
I think a lot of the core fundamentals are the same, but there are going to be some static differences that come a lot from that extended deadline capacity of it, because we've got those 24 to 48 hours in between rounds. That really allows us to get really deep into each individual round. We can talk to every player on the board. We can get really intricate into our strategy planning, negotiations, renegotiations. All these types of things really change the dynamic of how the game is played. We're also able to go to a full completion of a game if we want to. We can play for that end game scenario that doesn't always have an ability to happen when you're trying to fit a game into a single day. And I think there's a skill set that comes with that I found really interesting. We get to deal with a lot of players from around the world. A lot of times we're on boards where we don't know players in there. So we have that skill set where we have to be able to size up people really quickly, where we have to possibly vet them. And we can even have that option to investigate into people, because we do have some time in between where we can ask around or look at their other games. So there's different skill sets there that aren't necessarily accessible to the other formats.
Well, I know we're going to talk about the deadline question in a minute about Alliance player, but do you think that play style like Alliance player, balance of power player, et cetera, do you think those are more particularly apt for a style of face-to-face versus extended deadline versus a virtual face-to-face, or do you think it just doesn't matter?
I think it doesn't matter for most of it. I think playstyles all have their kind of time and place, regardless of whether you're playing face-to-face, online, or virtual. You shouldn't dismiss any style. It's suited more for one type of format or other. You might see some styles that have more in common with certain formats because of the benefits or the utility that they're a little bit more pronounced, but they're not as big of an influence as some of the other things. Like, for example, being an Alliance player, if you're in a format where you do tend to have repeat encounters more, I think you'll get some benefit from that in terms of getting that reputation where people want to work with you more because they know that about you. In our format, because we're dealing with different people a lot, or sometimes even anonymous games, you don't get that utility out of it. And on the flip side, I think that playstyle of Puppet Master, I assume this is something that you would see as well in face-to-face, but if you do, it's going to be a little bit different because we do have that ability to spend more time in controlling the entire board or controlling the grapevine or playing in the shadows a little bit more than you can when you're in a room with somebody. So there are going to be some different nuances of some of the play styles, but for the most part, you're going to have options to play these things in regardless of what the different genre is.
Well, let's just get to the deadline question then. When somebody says Alliance player, what does that phrase mean to you?
So for me, Alliance player is it's a strategic choice of how you want to play. And it's primarily centered around building and maintaining enduring relationships. It's chosen because you get some strategic benefits from it through mutual defense, access to information sharing, the ability to coordinate stronger offense against a common target, and combining your resources and geographic leverage to be able to do more with it. By investing in that deep trust and reliable communications with allies, you can really navigate the game a little bit more effectively than you could trying to do it individually. The teamwork and collaboration makes your position stronger and harder for opponents to be able to target you. It allows players to be able to position themselves better for more collaborative and individual goals and successes.
Do you think that phrase might mean something different to other diplomacy players? In other words, do you think people mean something different from from what you mean when you hear the term Alliance player or say the term Alliance player?
I do, yeah. I think of all the play styles that you hear, this is one that gets the most varied interpretations. I think for some players, Alliance player isn't so much a strategy as it is more of an ethos. It's a commitment to their alliances based on a desire to play more of a loyal and clean game. And that's more of a personal preference than it is the strategic advantage, even though you do get strategic advantage from it. And that's a very valid use of the term. I think for other people, if you play heavily in tournaments or leagues where reputation can be a very highly valuable commodity to have, Alliance play can become a sought-after title that you can cultivate across multiple games. That's going to make it increase your credibility and diplomatic capital that you can use within the community to provide advantage in future games for building alliances faster or just being able to make deals easier.
I think that when we talk about play styles and what play styles one should use, I think it's a popular answer, or at least I've heard it said a lot, that the best thing to do is just to be able to pick back and go back and forth and pick between different play styles as needed in a particular situation. Do you think that's truly doable for most people, that they can be a chameleon like that and kind of change their color as needed?
Yeah, I think it's possible. And it's recommended to work towards mastering as much as possible. I think it's very similar to being able to play different countries. You're going to have your play style is going to be more compatible. Some might be more compatible with your style or your skill set or your preferences. But the more you've got some ability to work with, the stronger you're going to be, the more you're going to be able to benefit from that. So I do recommend, even if you have one that you're comfortable with, get as many as you can, because there's going to be time and place for all of these different things, and you'll be able to benefit more from that.
Okay. Do you think that choice of play style can be affected by the tournament structure or format, like whether the game is going to be unlimited or into 1907, like some European tournaments do, or into 1910 or 1911, like VDL games do? Do you think that affects the play style that one either should use or in fact does use?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's where you're going to see a lot more benefit from being adaptable in these kinds of situations. Is they throw a lot of different things at you in these tournaments where it's really going to kind of change how things go and even within it. So tournaments with earlier end dates, for example, the ability to make quick gains is going to be really important, making a tempo-driven approach possibly more attractive. especially if you're in a country that tends to peak later in the game than some of the other ones. And then later set end dates, you might be more drawn to balance of power or transactional. So you can navigate those ebbs and flows a little bit better, handle some of the board reactions, not get stuck in that early leader syndrome, and position yourself strategically for when you need to be, in a strong position. Scoring systems are also going to make a difference. Alliance play is going to become popular in early rounds of tournaments where scoring systems that accommodate shared board tops, as a lot of tournaments can do, and people like that because they can, have a conservative play early on and put their efforts into getting to know other people and building that reputation of being a reputable, reliable ally. And whether it's going to have a final board versus points. If you're looking to really rack up points faster, that's a different approach than if you're looking to be one of the 7th best players in a tournament and then win it down that final board. So there's definitely a lot of different aspects in a tournament setting that are going to impact how you want to play.
That makes sense. Well, as we record this, I just got finished giving a little talk at the face-to-face tournament in Denver about play styles. And I talked about alliance player, balance of power, transactional, reactive, and unconventional as one way of looking at play styles. I think everybody likes to claim, at least at different times, that they are an alliance player. Do you claim that title for yourself?
Sure. I mean, I like to think I'm a blend of all different things, of all different styles. I think sometimes multiple styles within a given game. I do consider myself an alliance player as one of my options. But I think almost every player is an alliance player to an extent. I think that's a core part of the game, or at least they are until they're not. So you just need to pick the right tool for a given task. I've been doing a lot of tournament play lately, so I usually lean towards alliance play in earlier rounds. But if I get to top boards, then I tend to be a bit more, I guess what I consider a defensive expansionist. So it's a slow, calculated, just trying to get to that end game where I find on top boards a lot of times, it's just a few people who are in really close contention. So my goal is just to get there in a strong enough position, and everything there is kind of working up to that. That's my go-to, but I can definitely flip around to different play styles. Makes sense.
I think there are some people that think of themselves as alliance players, and what they do is they literally just pick an alliance partner and run the alliance until it's over, and they just sort of take whatever the result is. If that is what one does as an alliance player, do you think some of those people could or should utilize or broaden their play of the game in some other way, like try to use some other play styles to vary their game? And if so, why?
Yeah, for sure. I think most players, when they start, often are either alliance players or tempo players based on their personality. And then as they get more experience, they tend to, evolve and mature into how they want to play. If you rely exclusively on alliance play, it's going to be limiting. If you exclusively stick to it, I think you might eventually plateau. It's particularly challenging on higher level boards to be exclusive alliance player, just because of the sophistication of the other players on the board. They're going to adapt their game as the game evolves. They're going to prioritize what makes most strategic sense for them in their situation. And if you're just counting on them to be the other side of that alliance for alliance play, you really need to have two people involved with that. It's going to be harder to find that for a duration of a game at some of those higher level games. Other players will have relationships with everyone, and times will come where they need to shift, and they've got confidence in the diplomatic skill to be able to recover from alliance shifts. So you need to have that type of flexibility as well. It's okay if alliance play is your go-to. It works great in a lot of situations, but having more tools in your toolbox is just going to make you a stronger player.
Yeah, speaking of which, I think, some people might misconstrue the term alliance player to think that you never stab your ally, which is not really true. Even for most people that claim to be alliance players, that's not really what they're talking about. So given that fact, how or when do you think alliance players generally should consider stabbing their ally? When does that situation come up, or can that even be generalized?
I think, there truly are scenarios where people really don't ever stab. We see shared board tops all the time these days, or a lot of times it's let's wait till we get to the end and we'll have a two-way race and we'll just kind of race for it. But in genuinely competitive situations, it's not really that easy. You need to kind of know when to get out of it. A lot of times it tends to be later in the game. You want to be the person who makes a deal to, we'll go on 10 paces and draw. I'm going to shoot on 8 because I know you're going to shoot on 9 kind of thing. So, there's some timing to it. But alliance players, because alliance strategy play isn't necessarily monogamous loyal play. That's not entirely what it's about. It's about getting those benefits out of alliance. So a lot of times it's shifting to a new alliance. They've already got a new alliance set up to move on to. By the time they're ready to, this one has run its course and there's nothing more to it. It's not intended to be, for the most part, that that moral compass of I need to stick by a person forever. You can still play an alliance style play and have a little bit of shifting throughout the life of the game. So it's just knowing when to do it, having a plan, having an exit strategy, having that idea in your head earlier on, the better. But it's when the alliance doesn't have the same weight that it once had, it's time to look for other options.
I didn't prepare you for this question, but if you're playing with European players, for example, the ones that are just used to ending games in 1907, alliance player doesn't mean anything the same to some of those players because it just doesn't make sense for their game.
Yeah.
And by the time you get to 1905, you're already trying to figure out how you're going to scramble in 1907 to get more dots. It's just not the same game even.
Sure.
If you're an alliance player, and you're dealing with players, and I've done this myself. I'm sometimes an alliance player, and I've dealt with players, from Europe or wherever, just we're used to a different format. They just don't really even understand what you're talking about. They're all transactional players. How can you relate to different play styles if you're in that situation? If you're an alliance player and you can't find an alliance partner because there aren't any other alliance players near you. I mean, what do you do in that situation?
I mean, adapting to new environments is always going to be tricky. I'm finding that when I'm trying to adapt to going over to face-to-face, I'm not used to some of the meta that I see over there, and it is going to be a learning curve. But I find you can sometimes bring your style into that, because if you can be the one alliance in this chaotic world of everybody shooting each other, eating each other, you can get strength in that if you can find somebody else who shares that with you. But you have to understand that when you're in their world, that you might have difficulty in finding that person. So if you can sell that idea, great, but you have to go in the environment that you're in and dance the dance. That's
when in Rome.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, how about any final thoughts, Greg, that I haven't asked you about regarding this topic of alliance player? I'm going to be asking some other people this, but I want to get any more thoughts you have about it.
No, I just want to say thanks for bringing me on the show. It's been a lot of fun to discuss. If anybody's interested in having any more insight into what I think about playstyles, I do have a series of articles coming out right now on the Diplomat, talking about, I think about 6 different playstyles coming out over the summer. So if anybody's interested, give it a look.
Are you talking about on the Diplomat's YouTube or the diplomatic or the diplomacy briefing?
The briefing.
The briefing. Okay, got you. Yeah, the diplomacy briefing. Yeah. Well, everybody should be subscribing to that. That's watching this show. That's really an indispensable thing. It's all the hobby news and commentary you need every freaking week. I mean, it's amazing.
Good job.
I am glad to hear that you're doing that series of topics, and I will be covering that in future editions. So thanks for being on the show. And for those of you watching us out in Dipland, if you have thoughts about what an alliance player means to you, send those to me by Discord or Facebook message or using davidhood@dixiecon.com. I'll compile your submissions into a future Diplomacy World article, and then maybe have some of you here on the show to discuss your alliance player ideas on future episodes of Deadline. Thanks again, Greg.
Thanks, David.
Thanks to all of you watching at home. We hope you have enjoyed this broadcast of Deadline. If you have news, ideas for features, or feedback of any kind, please feel free to send an email to info@diplobn.com, or you can drop me a line directly using davidhood@dixiecon.com. To review all of our broadcast offerings, visit our website at diplobn.com. This is David Hood signing off. I wish you brightness and bliss and, of course, Belgium.